Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, July 1st, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about a Supreme Court decision that was released earlier on this morning today, a decision that will set precedent for likely decades to come. Voting on party lines in a 6-3 decision, this conservative Supreme Court ruled that former President Trump, and every president, is immune to federal prosecution on issues and decisions made in official capacities by the President of the United States, essentially ruling that if Donald Trump was acting in what was deemed to be an official action, and that is entirely ambiguous and likely with reason, he is completely and totally immune from any type of federal prosecution, statewide prosecution, any type of retribution. Really anything is ruled out the window, good or bad, for the justice system because he is president of the United States or was president of the United States. The Supreme Court made a very unprecedented decision today, one that many constitutional scholars believed was not rooted in reality or rooted in the Constitution. And while we can get into an entire conversation about the legality of it all, whether or not the Supreme Court was acting in the way that the Supreme Court should have been acting 50 years ago, 100 years ago, whether the court systems of those timeframes would have agreed with the decision today, the Supreme Court ultimately does have the final say on how the Constitution is to be interpreted. But it cannot be ignored that 3 out of the 6 justices on the Supreme Court today have been appointed by the former president. And it is very, very often that when court cases are brought up forth by a certain political party or a certain political candidate, if that candidate or that party is directly responsible for the appointment and confirmation of certain Supreme Court justices, they more than likely are going to rule in favor of that court system. At the end of the day, party system. At the end of the day, this decision comes at a time, too, where the Biden campaign desperately needed a shift in media attention, and they certainly got that today. After the Supreme Court decision this morning, practically every news article for the past few hours has been talking about this Donald Trump victory in the Supreme Court, questioning what's going to happen in the Georgia election subversion case, what's going to happen on Capitol Hill with Congress and their reaction to a decision like this one. With now representatives like AOC announcing that they are bringing forth the articles of impeachment against the justices that ruled in favor of Donald Trump, opposition pieces, and also just generally speaking, regular pieces from the legal department, from Politico, and other major sources talking about the left and the right agreeing on one thing: the justice system is corrupted by bias. A lot of the conversation we are going to be having today is directly about what we've seen from the United States Supreme Court, and that's a good thing for the Biden campaign, but a bad thing on the overall net. Because it means now that this election has been put back forth up to being entirely about the Supreme Court. And that's something that Democrats and Republicans are going to have to combat. And when I say entirely, I mean for this 24-hour news cycle. This is what's going to be the most prominent and pressing issue when it comes down to why people are voting and how they're voting. But in the actual November election, this is absolutely a piece of the puzzle that Democrats, Independents, and Republicans will keep in mind when they're getting to the ballot box. In the past 4 years, we have seen the true and total effect of what a Supreme Court that is lopsided in favor of one ideology can do. And in this instance, it helps the Republicans. The Supreme Court in years past has always been a major issue. In 2016, we talked about Roe v. Wade. In 2018, we talked about holding Trump accountable. In 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing away brought the Supreme Court back in full force. And then in 2022, the Supreme Court overturned a landmark decision of Roe v. Wade that was constitutional precedent for 49 years, ruling that abortion may be found illegal in some states. And so now the Supreme Court is bringing itself back into the fray of the 2024 election at a time where the Biden campaign, again, desperately needed it. Now, this election is still exceptionally close. Right now, it is a tie on the 2024 national forecast, taking into account the recent polls that show a bump for President Trump in the past few days following Thursday's debate. Data for Progress has Trump ahead by 3. Survey USA has Trump ahead by 2. Atlas Intel has Trump ahead by 6. Ledger and the New York Post has Trump ahead by 7. YouGov and The Economist, pre-debate, Morning Consult, Biden +1. And so, overall, Donald Trump has taken back the national lead, put himself back up in a favorable position, but the election is still close. And so the Biden campaign is questioning, how do they maneuver from this point on forward? After a debate performance like the one they saw on Thursday, they need to make this race about far more than it being a referendum for or against President Biden. And the Supreme Court gave them the ammunition to do exactly that. This decision comes at a time where many people are already upset with the Supreme Court. Right now, the Supreme Court stands at its lowest overall approval that it has ever had in the past 3 years. Even after Dobbs, the Supreme Court's approval rating has never been this low. And that's because general trust in the court system has dropped. Record lows, according to Gallup, last September. Today, even lower than last September. We are at a convergence point where the Supreme Court no longer stands to be a respected body, a body that either party wants to directly affiliate with, but the Trump campaign can't help themselves. Donald Trump today celebrated the victory, and it arguably was a major victory for him. It means that he cannot be prosecuted under something that could be under this guise of an official act. It leaves so much unresolved, sending the case back to trial court for further proceedings. Why? Because now it is on the prosecution to prove that Donald Trump was acting in an unofficial capacity in trying to overturn the Georgia election, in trying to overturn the 2020 election results, in denying the presidential election results. All of these things now have to go through an extensive layer of approval. And in this decision, the Supreme Court says that anything related to official or unofficial may be further appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. They are essentially giving the green light to the Trump team and Donald Trump's legal team to say, if you don't agree with how the judge decides to declare something unofficial versus official, and I can guarantee you they will appeal because their best chance at winning any of these cases is through the Supreme Court. They have given them the full green light to do so, and that's a problem for Democrats when it comes down to prosecuting Donald Trump, but also makes him look quite bad. When Donald Trump took credit for what was happening with Roe versus Wade, the Republican Party sort of came into a frenzy point. And what they decided to do there was adopt a more moderate approach to the issue of abortion. Donald Trump went on that debate stage and said while he was proud of overturning Roe versus Wade, that everyone agreed with him on that decision and that returning it to the states was the right choice. President Biden refuted that and said that's exactly what they said with civil rights. Now, it is a question of this election if Roe versus Wade was more important in 2022 than the Supreme Court is in 2024, and that is yet to be seen. But it never helps the Republican Party when the Supreme Court, which many Americans now associate with Donald Trump, now associate with a Republican Senate, now associate with the Republican Party, when they make decisions like this one. And the media narrative is that Donald Trump landed a major victory and is immune from prosecution. The average voter, too, isn't reading the nuances of this opinion. And while some people out there might argue that this leaves up a possibility for Trump to be prosecuted, it becomes 10 times harder. Which is why the media grabs this headline and says that he's immune from prosecution in some acts, because the acts are not clearly defined and it could be the Georgia prosecution case. Now, on one end, I've seen some analysis and media analysis, and I don't really agree with it, and I'll talk about why I don't right now. But the idea here was that it would completely prevent Georgia from being, held before November and thus helping Donald Trump. But here's the thing. The Georgia case was not going to happen, no matter what, in this November, October, September, July, August, whenever. It wasn't going to happen. Georgia's Court of Appeals indefinitely paused this election subversion case against Trump, and they're pushing it. They're pushing it until they can get confirmation if DA Willis can continue. They're pushing it until they can get confirmation now if this is an unofficial or official act. There are so many things now that might be pushing it, but it was already pushed. But this brings this issue and this Supreme Court case and this individual election subversion case back into the limelight. It's now going to be something that is directly mentioned when they talk about why this is a victory for Donald Trump, why Donald Trump was pushing for this in the first place. He was under prosecution for trying to overturn Georgia's 2020 presidential election, where he told Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State at the time, to find 11,000 votes in favor of Trump, and on voice recording, when Donald Trump lost by 11,000 votes. He was asking him to fabricate 11,000 votes. That's the way it has been universally understood. And so, looking at this election, looking at the way that, this Georgia election subversion case might have gone, in theory, it helps Trump in the long run. But in the immediate, it actually brings up old wounds and brings them back to the forefront of our conversation about the Supreme Court, about the Supreme Court's association with Donald Trump, and just generally speaking, puts it in a more negative light, even more negative than where they are right now. So this substantial immunity also comes, really to show that the Supreme Court does, in fact, have some level of bias, meaning that the 2024 election, should Donald Trump try to bring forth more court cases prior to the election, after the election, there could very well be more favorable responses. Even though they didn't take up the 2020 election rules, what's to say if 2024 gets even worse than January 6th? The reaction from the conservatives is even worse from the Republicans, from the diehard Donald Trump fans. That is something that these Supreme Court justices seem to be taking into account when they're making decisions like this one. They seem to be genuinely reading what Donald Trump is saying on Truth Social, and we have to entirely agree some of the things that are being done by people like Clarence Thomas do actually make a huge impact on the way the court is perceived. Right-wing or left-wing, Clarence Thomas should not be serving on the U.S. Supreme Court based on a lot of what we know about his relationships with billionaires and Republican donors and strategists. That is a clear conflict of interest. And yet, it seems to be A-okay in today's Supreme Court. I think we are going to find that the Supreme Court is going to become more prevalent in this election, especially as the Democratic Party shifts to focusing on being anti-Trump rather than pro-Biden. The Joe Biden campaign website released their analysis of the Project 2025 plan from the Heritage Foundation. The Heritage Foundation put together a suggested list of appointments and a 900-page plan detailing every part of the bureaucracy of the government, saying they want to expand executive power, and they detail exactly how they would do it. It's a blueprint for a Donald Trump Agenda 47 administration. And the Joe Biden campaign, the Democratic Party, have started to use this term, Project 2025, which has been entirely supported by Heritage Foundation and many people close to the former president, because it is now coming to be a major problem amongst the American public. If you look on social media, if you look on different portions of the country, in different regions of the country, Project 2025 is getting circulated. People are talking about it. People are talking about what Trump will do if he is reelected. And this is something that Democrats actually are doing quite well. They are making Project 2025 a very big thing, and it is now a question of what the Supreme Court will eventually limit, and clearly nothing. This Supreme Court decision gives the Democratic Party full green light in campaigning on this platform that Donald Trump will be left without full reign. And based on the national headlines, the average voter probably will believe that, because arguably it makes sense. The Supreme Court left so much up to the imagination of a prosecutor or a defendant that it could really just come in a variety of different ways. Is what Donald Trump is doing right now on official capacity, is when he's president, is that official? And then the decisions he makes in a, quote, unofficial capacity as a campaigner or as the Republican nominee for president. There are so many different questions that need to be asked, and you know when they can be asked, in time for next term. Well, that means June of 2025. Will make no impact on the outcome of this Georgia election case, may completely nullify the outcome of any of the cases surrounding January 6th, surrounding election subversion. There are so many things that we would find that the Supreme Court could just up and say, this is no longer valid because they don't believe it would be. And so Democrats are going to try to take this headline and take all this discourse around it and say, this is why this election matters. We've already started to see Democrats talk about how the 2016 election was arguably potentially one of the most important elections of anyone's lifetime. How Donald Trump being able to appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court has had a huge impact on the ideological diversity or lack of diversity and skew of this sitting bench of justices. A 6-3 advantage for conservatives in the Supreme Court is exactly what they want. But now it's going to be a question. Will it be 7-2? And the reason that is being raised for consideration is because Sonia Sotomayor is 70 years old. There is conversation about whether or not it's time for her to retire now. And should Donald Trump be elected and win for a 4-year term, she may resign from her position in office. She may resign and take a step back from the Supreme Court, and maybe even with a continuation of another term of a Republican president, of Trump's VP, which is exactly what he's looking for when he's making the decision as to who is his VP, we could be seeing so many things sort of stack up here. Trump administration, Vance administration, or Scott administration, then another 4 years. At some point, Sonia Sotomayor will have to retire, and that will be a problem for Democrats. And then we have to take into account that Democrats are going to campaign on this because Alito will retire. Thomas will retire. That will be 2 Supreme Court justices that are in their old age that will retire under a second Trump term to be replaced by 40-something-year-old conservative judges. There is a huge impact of the Supreme Court and the impact of it here on out, depending on what happens this November. And now the Democratic Party seems to be shifting all focus to the Supreme Court, to abortion, to all of these recent decisions that are breaking decades of precedent under a new ideologically conservative Supreme Court. A Supreme Court the likes of which America has never seen. And that's what Democrats are going to try to jump onto right now. Because even in the past 50 years, the most conservative-leaning court system couldn't strike down Roe versus Wade. The most conservative-leaning court system, or liberal-leaning, in the past 250 years, has never granted a president any type of immunity. Because that's not how this country, seemingly, was birthed. That's a problem. But again, a conversation for another video on the constitutionality of what the Supreme Court decided to do, and I get it. They ultimately rule in the highest court of the land. They do have the final say. But it doesn't mean that Americans approve, and it doesn't mean that it helps President Trump in any way. These decisions and the headlines that come with them and the discourse that comes with them helps halt some of this conversation around President Biden potentially being replaced, President Biden's viability. At a time where the Biden campaign needed it the most, they now have another piece of the news cycle that will be drowning out part of what has been dominating the campaign cycle on their end. There is now something else for pundits and the mainstream media to talk about, and that will help the Biden campaign get off of this ramp and get off of this really downward spiral and start building themselves back up going into November. This Supreme Court decision could not have come at a better time for the Biden campaign. And while clearly it was not the intention of the justices in any way to try to benefit the Biden campaign with a decision like this one, probably the exact opposite. It has done exactly that. The question is, how will the Supreme Court matter this November? Will it matter to the extent that it did in 2022? A lot of that, I genuinely believe, is up to the Democratic Party in the way they message, the way they strategize, the way they campaign between now and November. Because 4 months and 4 days out, they have very little time to completely rework the way that this election is viewed. But decisions and opinions like this one from the Supreme Court make it far easier to rework the election and what it is entirely about. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. At the top right of your screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for 2024 presidential election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.